welcome everybody. This is not only the first Business Agility Symposium, this is also the first event for the Business Agility Institute. I've known Marsha for a little over a year. We've had many a late night or early morning call over business agility and various topics, the penalty of time zones, I'm afraid. But today she's going to be sharing her insights on curiosity and how to foster and build that within your people.
I was asked to tell a story today, and my story really is, how did I become a business anthropologist? Why did I become a business anthropologist when there weren't any early in my career? And really, it was motivated by some of the same things that motivate Fabiola and Pia Maria, which was, but it comes out through the lens of business anthropology, which is how on earth did basically what were a bunch of small bands of primates create this monster business that leaves people out, that leaves people behind. Now, I was in graduate school in the 60s and 70s. Most of you probably weren't born yet. And I was pondering this matter and supporting myself by working in business. And I came to, here we are. I came to the conclusion that this was the most important thing I could do, was to investigate what does it take to include people in business, and rather than leave them out. And during my career, it's gotten worse. I mean, people were turned into trash in the 80s and 90s with what was at the time called downsizing or right-sizing, and I became more and more concerned about it. So I've studied with a number of neuroscientists, and here's what I have learned, that at puberty, our brains are essentially programmed to turn away from what's new and turn toward what the neural pathways that were built up until that time. If you can imagine yourself in a small group where you knew everyone your entire life, you very likely slept in a puppy pile with them, breathing together for a fair bit of the portion of each 24-hour day, and you really knew what to count on them for and what they needed help with. You knew it deep in your physiology. During the time that the brain was evolving, this was the circumstance in which our forebears lived. There was virtually no social uncertainty. There was some uncertainty about such things as whether lions might eat our children. And that, of course, gave rise to the inquiry that we now know as business agility. Question, how are we going to keep the lions away from our kids? Very likely gave rise to language and gave rise to noticing things like who has the strongest arm to throw stones, who can shout the loudest, who can jump up and down the highest, and who could get the kids up the tree faster. And there you have it. That's the beginning of what we call business. Now we're asking ourselves questions like, well, what about the people who don't want Alexa in their homes? In my inquiry during this time, both on my own and with social neuroscientists, I am convinced that belonging is the brain's single most powerful driver. There are a number of bits of evidence for that. I agree with my colleagues here that there is some variation about the extent to which people hunger for that. But let me say that social animals die of grief much more often than they die of hunger. There's lots of good stuff about that. There's a famous story about the orang and the dog, which you've probably heard. The dog both of them were dying, and they happened to bump into each other in a reserve. And here you are. This is what happens. Somehow, don't know exactly how. But here's what we do know, that the brain's primary function is regulation. Our brains are regulating our metabolism right now. Unfortunately, we're not all in the same room, so we're probably not co-regulating in the way we might if we were in the same room. But I'm getting some pleasure from being with my colleagues, and I'm imagining that everybody else in this webinar is also getting a kind of pleasure from being with our tribe. Imagine that it amplified, which is what happened during the time that the brain was evolving. So I am claiming as a business anthropologist that the value of all of the exchanges that make up our businesses is experienced with brain chemicals. We are all drug addicts. We love contributing. In this network of exchanges, which is now so much more complicated than it was during the time the brain evolved, we are still as vulnerable socially as we ever were, because our experience is determined by our brains, not by what's going on out there. And the human brain did evolve to keep us focused on cooperation and coordination. You probably have lots of experience of that. I'm not going to go into the experiments now, but emotions mostly are controlling our focus on exchanges with other people. If people want more information about that, I can provide it. I'll give you a little snapshot of a very powerful experiment in social neuroscience. Undergraduates were put in an MRI, an fMRI it's called, and they were told that they were going to be throwing a ball with two other individuals, and there's a screen and the students could see the two cartoons throwing a ball to each other, and sometimes they threw it to the student, and the student had the ability to decide which one to throw it back to. And that went on for maybe a minute and a half, and then the two cartoon characters stopped throwing the ball to the student and just kept throwing it to each other. The results were extraordinary. People came out of the MRI saying they didn't like me. I felt rejected. This powerful, powerful drugs. So that inclusion is, that need for inclusion, I think, has probably driven many social attempts at certainty. These are just a few on my screen that amazed me as I was growing up. Your third born son, you'll be a priest. To my baby boomer brain, I was like, huh? How is it possible that we invented a society that ran that way? And I'm afraid that the answer is we get addicted to social certainty. However, we're living in a world where we don't get much of that. The world we live in, as you very well know, is a world where the people who are trading with us in our business ecosystem are living in a shifting environment. Their concerns change, their desires change, what they value changes. And we can either go to where many social animals go, which is us and them. Well, those idiots aren't buying our products. What's wrong with them? That's a little less popular than it was when I was in graduate school. However, the ingenuity that I saw being undermined is not an easy thing to sustain. And the reason for that is social uncertainty. So let me explain what I mean by that. In order to be curious about what's going on, let's say with your employees or your suppliers or your strategic allies who seem not to be cooperating, we have to have the skill to recognize that we're moving into us and them, which unfortunately is a very, very deep instinct. It shows up in infants who are as young as 3 months old, and it's pretty well there by the time they're 6 months old. And it really inhibits our ability to perform in Agile, to actually live an Agile life. When we are socially uncertain, our prefrontal cortex shuts down. Any kind of uncertainty, flight, fight, or freeze. That's what we do. When you see a bear, unless you have been trained to be around bears, you will do one of those three things. Whether it's the right one or not, doesn't matter, because your prefrontal cortex stops. So I'm here to ask you, what has to happen in order for you to continue to be curious? And this is an example that comes from one of my many projects. I'm not allowed to say the name of the company. Funny. So I was working with an executive, and I gave him a task to do, and he came back, and this is what he said. I don't want you to tell anyone I said this, but all the best teams have single mothers, and I have no idea why. I mean, you're going to tell me why that is, right? Which I did. I said, yes, I can tell you exactly why that is. The single mothers are more vulnerable than everybody else on the team, and everybody on the team got curious about how they could take care of the single mothers. They were better at coordination, they were better at collaboration than the other teams because they had somebody vulnerable to take care of. They got smarter. And that's what happens when we embrace vulnerability. So how do we do that in our businesses? How do we embrace vulnerability, which the brain doesn't really like? How can we do it on scale? How can we move away from us and them and get fascinated by vulnerability? And that's what I've been doing for the past almost 4 decades. And I discovered that sincere inquiry is really a silver bullet. That whether or not vulnerability is right in front of you, like a single mother that actually has to be able to get to daycare before 5 o'clock or her baby's going to be outside by itself. We have other ways that we can sustain inquiry about vulnerability. And I've essentially spent my career doing that. How do you do that? So, for example, if you have a really clear core promise, if your business has a really clear core promise, there's always the possibility of how we're going to fulfill that today, given the shifting concerns of the people in our ecosystem. If they are empowered to do it, maybe, we can have branded rituals, which, as you know, works very well in Agile teams. They have ceremonies, they have rituals in which they examine together. Yes, we have to have rest and all the stuff that allows us to be physiologically okay. Rest is one of the big ones. Got to slow down, got to stop multitasking. And you all are going to have these slides so you can play with this. So what I've discovered is that we can do it. And there are many tools that I've developed and others are developing to help people stay curious and finesse uncertainty. So you all are already pre-sold on the ROI for meeting the brain's social hunger. I just want to say that from my point of view, the brain's social hunger, the deepest is for co-regulation with another human being or other human beings. Breathe with them, look into their eyes. Nothing will ever substitute for that. And if you do it, you will get all these wonderful rewards. My team is testing a new tool. If your organization would like to participate in this test, we would be delighted. Which is focused on keeping people curious about what's going on in this business ecosystem. And really, it is about the gift of curiosity, bringing the gift of curiosity to your ecosystem. That's really all I have to say. I'm very grateful for all of the teachers and researchers that preceded me. And here are a few easily accessible books for those of you who want more. And there will be more at the Business Agility Conference. I'm going to tell some juicy stories about how I got curiosity going in impossible environments.
All right.